I'm Craig Cornelius, CEO of Clearway Energy Group and the chairman of the American Clean Power Association. Thank you for this opportunity to address you all today. And thank you especially to Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions for what you do to engage policymakers and the public across the political spectrum about the responsible solutions we need to address America's energy, economic, and environmental security. The environment that shapes our way of life here in America and around the globe exists without any political affiliation. It's a natural environment which ultimately doesn't distinguish between parties that people vote for, but it's surely impacted by what we as people put into our air, our waters, and our land. I'm hopeful that we will ultimately ground our national conversation on climate change and the human actions that can mitigate it in this simple fact. When we get there, it will be because we found ways to bring together people who disagree on other areas of government and society, but who have otherwise come together to agree on actions that will preserve the place we live in together. That's why gatherings like this are so vital. This forum demonstrates real work towards bipartisan consensus around advancing reliable, clean energy, addressing climate change, making our economy more resilient and self-reliant, and equitably creating good jobs across our country. There's a transformation going on in this country today that should give every American hope, and frankly, it's still an undertold story. It's a story that draws from the character of the American people and our rich history of resilience and innovation. We're just at the beginning of the most exciting economic transformation since the Industrial Revolution, and I'm very proud that Clearway is at the forefront of that transformation. We're one of the largest clean energy companies in the country, with more than 8 gigawatts of energy assets in 26 states, including enough solar, wind, and renewable energy-driven storage to power more than 1.7 million American homes. We're breaking ground in communities all across the country today. Whether it's grid-scale solar projects in Arizona or wind farms in West Virginia, our power plants are helping to solve our toughest energy challenges. But as an industry, we have to get better at pulling back the curtain on what's happening on the ground in some of these places. So I want to share a little of what it looks like from our vantage point here at Clearway. First and foremost, I see the clean energy transition helping to maintain America's economic competitiveness. Over the last 40 years, the rapid innovation and change our country's economy has experienced has often been uneven. It's left many groups of people and swaths of our country behind. The exclusion from opportunity that's represented has inflamed division in our country. It's left some folks out of benefiting from a growing economy because they've worked in industries that have gone away. It's made rural communities and urban communities often feel like they have little in common interest. And it hasn't created openings for some folks who just never have gotten a shot at personal and professional progress in our country. Clean energy deployment here in America can be an antidote. Today, nearly 80% of American clean power capacity is installed in low-income counties or counties where the median household income falls below the national median household income. Clearway alone employs hundreds of people in rural America. We operate renewable energy power plants that generate nearly 13 terawatts of clean power each year, and they're often in communities that have long produced traditional sources of energy. And what's more, the vast majority of those power plants were built with folks who are union workers or who are paid better than prevailing wages for their jobs. And the folks we employ to keep running them today and growing our company all receive pay and benefits that support a good way of life. For us, we see that an all of the above approach is not just good for households and businesses, but it's also good for the energy worker and the community they live in. And that's true just for the workers at our one company. Overall, our industry will employ nearly 1 million Americans by 2030, up from the nearly 500,000 we employ today. And the benefits extend far beyond rural communities in the form of paychecks. Our industry is paying $1.3 billion annually in state and local taxes every year, and new emerging projects will create $17 billion in state and local revenues for new schools, roads, and projects in local communities. Thanks to the success of the clean energy industry, there's now growing awareness on both sides of the aisle of the value that these clean energy projects can deliver to communities, and that gives us growing common ground to stand on. Consider this. 18 of the top 20 districts by clean power capacity in our country are represented by Republicans. There are clean energy projects or manufacturing facilities in 93% of congressional districts. There are 170 districts in Congress with at least 100 megawatts of clean power capacity installed in them. And there's over 50 congressional districts with at least 1,000 megawatts of renewable power generation installed in them, a number that's set to grow dramatically during the decade to come. Both red America and blue America have a huge stake in the clean energy transition, but rural America in particular is at its forefront. This transition is a profound opportunity for these regions to reverse decades of disinvestment. Unlike the tech sector, which has often fueled economic growth for the last 2 decades, but left many people out, clean energy puts rural America right there in the driver's seat. Over the next decade, our company alone will make billions of dollars of investments in clean energy infrastructure across the country in these rural communities. We're doing it in Wyoming, we're doing it in Washington, we're doing it in West Virginia, points in between, and we're far from the only ones who are going to be doing that. Of course, many of the energy headlines in the news today remind us of the challenges we face, not just here, but across the world. Not since the 1970s energy crisis have energy availability and reliability been so top of mind for the American people or people around the globe. As more and more Americans experience increased costs and outages, reliable power is no longer a given. And further, American household budgets have taken a big hit from energy this year. As hard as it's been here at home for low and middle income families, we only need to look to Europe to see how much worse things can get. As we speak, some European factories have ceased operations. Governments are subsidizing utility bills so that citizens can keep their lights on. In Spain, during a recent heat wave, the government dictated the exact temperature of commercial air conditioning. Here at home, we can and must chart our own energy future, keeping the interest of the consumer front and center. Just as the United States turned the tables geopolitically by becoming a net energy exporter in the 1980s and 90s, it's imperative that we continue to diversify and expand our energy portfolio to insulate our economy from the shock of price spikes in the market and bolster our allies in times of crisis like this one. Thankfully, there's growing bipartisan consensus that Americans shouldn't be vulnerable to the whims of tyrants as they put gas in their car or pay their utility bills, and that renewable and clean power can be part of the solution to that problem. European countries are rapidly accelerating their clean energy development and deployment to respond to this crisis. And here at home in America, we shouldn't wait for another energy crisis on a similar scale to do likewise. Europe's lesson should be our lesson. The time to learn it is now. We now have the market policy incentives, fortunately, to do just that here in America. And fortunately, the passage of legislation here this year is setting the stage for that. As we look for areas for bipartisan cooperation on this challenge, I certainly recognize the unfortunate reality that both the debate and the legislative process to pass the Inflation Reduction Act had pretty heavy partisan overtones. However, I hope that we can be united in celebrating the economic development and jobs that this new law will help create, particularly in rural American communities that haven't reaped the benefits of recent economic growth. As renewable power continues to win hearts and minds across the country, I'm optimistic that greater policy consensus for our industry will emerge. To that end, it's worth noting that the large obstacles that remain to a resilient energy future for our country, and where I believe there's ample common ground, supply chain challenges are acute in our industry, and increased demand for clean power is set to further intensify these challenges, particularly in the solar and battery sectors. In 2021, the US installed twice as much solar as it manufactured, revealing a huge gap in the supply and demand in our country. It's important that federal lawmakers acknowledge this predicament in the new law that was just passed. For the last decade, we've left ourselves as a country in a really self-defeating position. We've thrown up unpredictable and changing import restrictions that make electricity more expensive for Americans without also fundamentally changing the equation to get more of our power equipment actually manufactured here. There just isn't much common sense in canceling or delaying projects that could be built today, providing economic and environmental benefits to our American communities, because we impose tariffs on panel imports when no domestic source for those panels exists. But that's what our policies have been doing. Fortunately, the supply side and demand side incentives contained in the Inflation Reduction Act are really going to change this equation. They're transformative in creating the conditions needed for more of our power generating equipment to be made here. And the response from industries to that opportunity is going to change our American industrial landscape for decades to come. We're on the cusp of a stampede of new manufacturing plant investments that are going to be made here in our country during the years ahead. As a result of this legislation, and crucially, these new factories will supply demand here in the US while allowing the power plants constructed with their equipment to offer low electricity prices to customers here. Now, it's going to take some time for our domestic manufacturing base to catch up with our domestic demand. And for some interim time, we're going to need to be prepared to see our power plants built with equipment that comes from abroad some of the time. But that's going to be worth doing to rapidly lower energy costs for consumers here. And the amount of equipment we have to import is really going to shrink as we move through this decade. It's so exciting to those of us who've been building this industry for the last decades. Another stubborn obstacle to growth is getting renewable power from where it's generated to where it's needed. For those of us working to keep the lights on, the transmission conundrum is what's often keeping us up at night. It's an enormous impediment, regardless of the energy source, but it's one where we can also build a broad coalition to resolve it. Fortunately, federal officials on both sides of the aisle recognize the problem. FERC has acknowledged, whether it's citing transmission lines or log-jammed interconnection queues, that things need to change and soon. The interconnection backlog is particularly challenging for the renewable energy sector, with 90% of the queue for new projects comprising wind, solar, and storage projects that are critical for grid resilience and cost reduction. A great opportunity to tackle that problem is in front of us with the proposition of passing new legislation that will streamline the permitting for large renewable energy and transmission projects, and to simplify the allocation of costs from transmission so it can be built to connect places where we've got rich renewable resources to places where we've got lots of electrical load. Congress is going to have the opportunity to act on this as soon as the end of this month. And the provisions that are being contemplated have the potential to fundamentally change the impediments to clean power deployment at scale that we've had a hard time unwinding for decades. We understand that there are concerns that come with changing laws that have been crafted to protect the environment. But we're at a point today where finding ways to accelerate renewable deployment is the best single thing we can do to preserve our environment for future generations. So we're really hopeful that this legislation will see its way to passage, as its impact on transmission, especially in future years, could be really transformative. The consensus from this forum is really clear and encouraging. Diverse, affordable, domestically sourced power is fundamental, not just to the financial security of American families, but to our nation's health, safety, and well-being. I'm optimistic that clean energy can soon be an exception to the bitter partisanship that's undermining our country. After all, every American benefits from its success. We all have a stake. As long as we rely on our greatest assets, America's workforce, our penchant for innovation, and our free markets, will solve the climate challenge and lead the world emerging stronger and more resilient. Renewal, resilience, and reinvention. They've always been what's gotten America through its toughest challenges. And that's the story we're looking forward to writing for our country with the coming generation of clean power deployment yet again. And it's why I have the brightest of hopes for our country's tomorrow. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak with you today. And thank you for all that you're doing for our cause.